In mid-March 2026, the United States fertilizer supply was at 75% of normal levels. That is a quarter of the fertilizer that American farms need to grow the food that feeds 330 million people. Missing. And it was missing at the exact moment when Corn Belt farmers were preparing their soil for planting and making their first applications of fertilizer for the season. Subsequent applications typically come from mid-April to early May and again between late May and mid-June. And the reason a quarter of America's fertilizer supply was missing is that the Strait of Hormuz, which carries approximately one-third of all internationally traded fertilizer, had been closed since February 28th by the Iranian military in retaliation for U.S. Israeli airstrikes. And some of those fertilizers rose more than 40% in just 1 month after the war began, according to research published in The Conversation by Aya Chacar, a professor of international business at Florida International University. 40% in 1 month. And here's what most Americans do not understand about fertilizer timing. Cereal plants, corn and wheat in particular, absorb the vast majority of their nitrogen needs during their early growth phase. Applying fertilizer later in the growth cycle is dramatically less effective. Research shows that reducing nitrogen application by just 10 to 15% or delaying the application by 2 to 4 weeks can reduce corn yields by 10 to 25%. A 25% reduction in American corn yields would be catastrophic because corn is not just the yellow vegetable you buy at the grocery store. Corn is the foundation of the American food system. Corn is animal feed. Corn is high-fructose corn syrup in thousands of processed foods. Corn is ethanol blended into gasoline. Corn is the raw material for the plastics and packaging that store and ship the rest of the food supply. When corn yields fall, everything built on corn gets more expensive. Everything. And right now, as you are watching this video, the planting window is closing. The fertilizer is late. The fertilizer that arrived is 40% more expensive. And the farmers who fear not being able to optimize their yields are making a decision right now to either plant less corn or switch to soybeans, which need less fertilizer. Either choice reduces the corn supply. And a reduced corn supply in August and September, when the harvest comes in, will trigger price increases across the entire American food chain that will make the past 3 years of grocery inflation look like a warm-up. People do not realize what is about to hit grocery stores this summer, and I'm going to walk through every piece of it, because this is not one problem. It is 7 problems hitting the American food supply simultaneously, and not one of them has a solution that arrives before your grocery bill does. The 7 problems are these. 1. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed for 7 weeks, blocking 1/3 of internationally traded fertilizer during the most critical window of the American planting season. 2. Fertilizer prices rose 40% in a single month and the supply was at 75% of normal at the start of planting. 3. The U.S. beef cattle herd has shrunk to its lowest level since 1962, restricting meat supply for years. 4. Avian influenza has resulted in the culling of more than 185 million birds, the largest animal disease event in American history, leaving the egg and poultry supply permanently fragile. 5. Mass deportations have gutted the farm labor force that harvests the produce Americans eat every day. 6. Farm bankruptcies are soaring. Farm debt is at a record high and only 52% of American farmers will be profitable this year. 7. SNAP benefits are being cut by 36% over the next decade at the exact moment food prices are about to spike, removing the food purchasing power of the 40 million Americans who depend on the program. Each of these problems individually would strain the food system. Together, arriving simultaneously in a single summer, they will produce the most severe grocery price crisis in modern American history. And the USDA's food price forecast of 3.1%, which is the number being cited by politicians and the media, was calculated using data from before the war began. That number is already a fantasy. And I'm going to explain why with the specific data, the specific timelines, and the specific mechanisms that will take the food from the field to the shelf to your table at a cost that will shock even the Americans who thought they were already prepared for higher prices. The Strait of Hormuz carries 1/3 of the world's fertilizer and it has been closed for 7 weeks. The global energy crisis caused by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is the headline that everyone has been following. 20% of the world's oil, 20% of liquefied natural gas. But the piece of the Hormuz story that will hit American grocery stores hardest is not the oil. It is the fertilizer. One-third of all internationally traded fertilizer passes through the Strait of Hormuz, and the strait has been effectively closed since February 28th. As of April 9th, despite the ceasefire announced on April 8th, no ships were freely transiting the strait. Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO Sultan Al Jaber confirmed that 230 loaded tankers were still waiting inside the Gulf. And according to one report, Iran has lost track of mines it planted in the waterway, which means the strait may be physically impossible to fully reopen, even with a peace agreement, because the mines are still there, drifting, uncharted, lethal to any vessel that hits one. The UN World Food Program predicted that an additional 45 million people worldwide could face hunger by the end of 2026 if the conflict continues into the middle of the year. That is on top of the more than 300 million people who already do not have enough food globally. Crop yields in India and Brazil are expected to be lower than normal in 2026 because of the fertilizer disruption. East African farmers, who could barely afford fertilizer before the crisis, will have to make do with even less. And the United States is not immune to global food prices. Kjetil Storesletten, an economist and professor at the University of Minnesota and director of the Heller-Hurwitz Economics Institute, told CNBC that the price of food is going to move quite a lot, and that the increased price of fertilizer is going to be passed through to food. All of it. Because farmers, processors, and retailers operate in low-margin industries, according to Cornell University professor Christopher Barrett. They cannot absorb the cost. They pass it through. Every dollar of fertilizer increase becomes a dollar of food increase somewhere in the chain. And a 40% fertilizer increase, sustained over a planting season, becomes a food price increase that arrives at American grocery stores in July, August, and September when the harvest-priced goods reach the shelf. The USDA projected 3.1% food inflation before the war, and that number is already obsolete. In March 2026, the USDA released its annual food price forecast. The projection called for a 3.1% average increase in all food prices for the year, with a prediction interval of 0.7 to 5.7%. But the USDA used data from before the Iran war to generate that forecast. The war began on February 28th. The forecast was released in March using data that did not capture the oil shock, the fertilizer disruption, the shipping crisis, or any of the cascading effects that followed. The 3.1% projection is not wrong because the USDA made an error. It is wrong because the world changed after the data was collected, and the specific price increases the USDA forecast for individual categories are already being overtaken by reality. The USDA projected that beef and veal prices would rise significantly in 2026 and noted that beef and veal prices were already 15% higher in January 2026 than in January 2025. That increase is being driven by the U.S. beef cattle inventory shrinking to its lowest level since 1962 after a combination of persistent drought and high costs in 2022 forced producers to kill 13.3% of the national beef cow herd, the highest proportion ever recorded. Farm-level cattle prices were 26.5% higher in August 2025 than the previous year. Wholesale beef prices increased 12%. And consumers are paying the result at the meat counter. The USDA also projected that sugar and sweets would rise 6.7%, with candy and chewing gum experiencing the largest hikes. Non-alcoholic beverages were forecast to rise 5.2%. And egg prices, which had been declining after hitting an all-time average high of $6.23 per dozen earlier in 2025, were expected to stabilize. But the USDA's forecast for eggs did not account for the ongoing avian influenza outbreak that has now resulted in the culling of more than 185 million birds since 2022, the largest animal disease event in American history. The egg market remains one single outbreak away from another price explosion because the flock has been rebuilt on the same concentrated industrial model that made it vulnerable in the first place. Max Teplitsky, chief science officer at the International Fresh Produce Association, told CNBC that because produce has to be shipped and kept refrigerated, it cannot be stockpiled. There is a significant energy cost just to keep it on the shelf or in storage, and as energy prices rise, they drive higher prices for consumers. And Teplitsky added that further economic hurt could come from increased prices for plastics. Many food goods are stored in plastic containers, and much of domestic plastics production relies on natural gas. As oil is taken out of the equation, natural gas becomes more of a premium commodity with less available for packaging. The secondary effects are cascading: food prices, packaging prices, refrigeration costs, shipping costs. Every input into the grocery system is being repriced simultaneously by the same war that most Americans think of as a foreign policy story, not a food story. And the beef situation deserves its own examination because it is the most viscerally felt food price increase for the average American household. The U.S. beef cattle inventory shrank to its lowest level since 1962 after a combination of persistent drought and high costs in 2022 forced producers to kill 13.3% of the national beef cow herd, the highest proportion ever recorded. When you kill the breeding cows, you are not just reducing today's supply. You are eliminating the future supply because those cows are the mothers of the calves that would have become next year's beef. It takes approximately 2 to 3 years for a beef cow to produce a market-ready animal, which means the herd liquidation of 2022 is still suppressing supply in 2026 and will continue to suppress supply into 2027 and 2028. Farm-level cattle prices were 26.5% higher in August 2025 than the previous year. And when feed costs become unsustainable, as they are becoming right now due to the fertilizer-driven corn yield reduction, farmers are forced to kill or sell off even more of the breeding stock that represents the future of the beef supply. That is exactly what happened in 2012 when a historic Midwest drought slashed corn yields by 13%, triggered a surge in feed prices, and caused U.S. poultry prices to rise 20%. The current situation is worse than 2012 because the drought damage is compounded by the fertilizer disruption, the energy cost increase, and the labor shortage, none of which were factors in 2012. Treasury Secretary Bessent blamed spiking beef prices on market dynamics in November 2025, but market dynamics is a euphemism for a structural supply crisis that no policy intervention can reverse in less than 3 years because you cannot speed up the biology of cattle reproduction. Farm labor has been gutted by deportation, and there is nobody left to harvest the food that did get planted. Cornell University professor Christopher Barrett told Newsweek that production costs are rising and that labor accounts for half the cost of the food in your grocery cart, and more in the case of restaurant food. He said the food system is especially dependent on foreign-born workers and that current immigration policy and tactics are creating labor shortages and driving up the cost of the food system workforce. And the Investigate Midwest documented that the White House policy of mass deportations created a significant labor shortage of agricultural workers in 2025. Foreign workers, many undocumented, take agricultural jobs that most Americans are not willing to do, such as 12-hour shifts in extremely hot fields to pick vegetables or work in hazardous meatpacking plants cutting up animal carcasses. Fear of deportation sweeps led to a major workforce reduction in California, according to university analysis. And the labor shortage does not just raise wages, which would at least keep the workers in the fields at a higher cost. The labor shortage causes crop losses. Produce that is ready to harvest but has no one to harvest it rots in the field. Fruit that falls from the tree because there are not enough pickers to collect it within the 2 to 3 day ripening window is wasted. And every ton of wasted produce is a ton less supply at the grocery store, which means the produce that does make it to the shelf commands a higher price because there is less of it. The timing of the labor shortage compounds every other problem in the food supply chain. Farmers who reduced their corn acreage because of fertilizer costs and planted fewer total acres are now also facing the prospect of harvesting whatever they did plant with fewer workers at higher wages. The input cost went up, the yield went down, the labor cost went up, the labor supply went down, and the diesel that powers the equipment needed to bridge the gap between labor supply and harvest demand is $4.15 per gallon and rising. Every variable in the equation is moving in the wrong direction simultaneously. And the American grocery store, which operates on a 72-hour inventory cycle with no strategic food reserve equivalent to the strategic petroleum reserve for oil, has approximately 3 days of food on its shelves at any given time. 3 days. There is no buffer. When supply tightens, the shelves thin. When the shelves thin, panic buying starts. And panic buying creates the shortages that people were afraid of, even in markets where the underlying supply was not disrupted. The psychology of scarcity is as damaging as the scarcity itself. And the American consumer has been primed for that psychology by 3 years of inflation, 6 weeks of war headlines, and the visible experience of $6 eggs that are seared into every shopper's memory. and the immigration enforcement impact on the food system is being described by food policy experts in terms that should alarm every American regardless of their views on immigration policy. Cooley, a food systems researcher quoted by Grist, said that the immigration crackdown continues to throttle the farm and food sectors with labor shortages that risk supply shortfalls and sticker shock. She described local governments, food banks, and state agencies as being in constant emergency pivot mode as the administration moves massive amounts of demand back to the private sector and local governments to fill gaps that are impossible to fill. She asked the fundamental question that nobody in Washington has answered. What even is the president's vision of an operational food system? The question is not rhetorical. There is no plan. The labor is being removed. The subsidies are being cut. The farm bill is expired. The SNAP program is being slashed. The fertilizer is disrupted. The energy is expensive. And no one in any position of authority has articulated a coherent vision for how the American food system operates under these conditions. The assumption appears to be that the market will adjust. But the market adjusting means higher prices, and higher prices for families who are already skipping meals mean less food. The market adjusting is the market working, but the market working means people going hungry. Farm bankruptcies are soaring and farm debt is set to hit a record, and only 52% of farmers will be profitable this year. The foundation of the American food supply is the American farmer, and the American farmer is in the worst financial position in a generation. Grist reported that farm bankruptcies are soaring and farm debt is set to hit a record high in 2026. The ABA/Farmer Mac Agricultural Lender Survey projects that only 52% of U.S. farm borrowers will be profitable this year. That means nearly half of American farmers are operating at a loss, and the Federal Bank of Chicago reported an estimated crop loss of $10 billion for soybeans, $20 billion for corn, and $8.5 billion for wheat in the most recent reporting period. Rising input costs for seeds, fuel, and fertilizers, combined with low crop prices from global oversupply in some categories, higher interest rates on farm debt, and the impact of the trade war are squeezing farmers from both sides. Costs are up, revenue is flat or down, and the government shutdown froze financial assistance to farmers during the critical harvesting and crop planting season, creating what Semenova at Grist described as potential risks to the U.S. food supply chain in 2026 and 2027. Without adequate financial assistance from the federal government, the nation's food is on track to become more expensive and more limited in supply. And the Farm Bill, which is the foundational federal legislation that governs agricultural policy, subsidies, crop insurance, and food assistance, has not been reauthorized. The One Big Beautiful Bill extended the 2018 Farm Bill through September 30, 2026. It is the third such extension due to the inability of the Senate and House Agricultural Committees to reach consensus, which means the policy framework governing American agriculture is operating on a 6-year-old law that was written before the pandemic, before the inflation crisis, before the Iran war, before the fertilizer disruption, and before the labor shortage. The law does not contemplate any of the current conditions, and the political dynamics of the midterm election year make a new Farm Bill passage essentially impossible before the extension expires in September. American agriculture is operating without a current legal framework, without adequate financial support, with a depleted labor force, with disrupted fertilizer supplies, with record-high input costs, and with nearly half its operators losing money. That is the foundation on which the food that appears in your grocery store this summer is being grown, or not being grown. SNAP cuts are hitting at the exact moment food prices are about to spike, and 40 million Americans depend on the program. The timing of the SNAP cuts in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act could not be worse if it were designed to maximize human suffering. The legislation slashes $295 billion in federal SNAP funding over the next decade, a 36% reduction that the Commonwealth Fund described as historically unprecedented. Work requirements are being expanded to include adults aged 55 to 64 for the first time. Benefits will be cut by approximately $100 per month for roughly 600,000 low-income households. And the standard utility allowances and other simplifications that made the program accessible are being eliminated, adding paperwork barriers that will cause eligible people to lose benefits through administrative failure rather than ineligibility. 8 million seniors depend on SNAP. More than 40 million Americans total rely on the program, And the cuts are arriving at the exact moment that grocery prices are about to experience the war-driven, fertilizer-driven, labor-driven, energy-driven, cattle herd-driven convergence I have been describing for the past 15 minutes. 14% of American households reported food insecurity between January and October 2025, according to Purdue University, up from 12.5% in 2024. In New York City, 40% of families cannot afford their weekly food costs, according to Robin Hood and Columbia University. 1 in 3 Americans, 34%, skipped a meal in the past year, according to the Century Foundation, up from 1 in 4 just months earlier. And a growing number of Americans are using buy now, pay later plans to pay for groceries because they cannot afford to pay at the register. The SNAP cuts will reduce the food purchasing power of the poorest Americans at the exact moment when food prices are rising the fastest, in the category of spending that is least discretionary and most immediately connected to physical survival. And when SNAP shrinks, the entire food economy shrinks. Food banks, which already reported record demand in 2024 and 2025, will face a surge that their current capacity cannot absorb. Local grocery stores in low-income neighborhoods, which depend heavily on SNAP dollars for revenue, will see sales decline, which will lead to reduced inventory, which will lead to higher prices on whatever remains, which will lead to store closures, which will create food deserts in communities that were already underserved. The feedback loop is predictable, documented, and has been observed in every previous SNAP reduction. And this is the largest SNAP reduction in the program's 90-year history. And the food bank system that is supposed to catch the people who fall through the SNAP safety net is already overwhelmed before the cuts take effect. Feeding America, the largest hunger relief organization in the country, reported record demand at food pantries in 2024 and 2025. In Detroit, people are waiting in lines that stretch for blocks to receive emergency groceries from nonprofits like Forgotten Harvest. And the government shutdown earlier this year, during which at least 25 states announced that SNAP benefits would not be paid, gave America a preview of what happens when the food assistance system breaks down. Food banks were flooded with demand they could not meet. Grocery stores in low-income neighborhoods lost a significant portion of their revenue because SNAP dollars disappeared from the local economy, and farmers who depend on SNAP purchases as a downstream demand driver for their produce saw yet another hit to already fragile revenue streams. Jared Grant, an agricultural economist at Ohio State University, told Grist that the shutdown exposed vulnerabilities throughout the nation's food supply chain that could shift consumer behavior and slow overall consumer spending. When SNAP shrinks, the damage extends far beyond the individual households that receive benefits. It contracts the entire food economy of the communities where those households live. Fewer SNAP dollars means fewer grocery sales. Fewer grocery sales means fewer jobs at the store. Fewer jobs means less income in the community. Less income means more households that now need SNAP themselves. The contraction feeds on itself, and by August, the combination of SNAP cuts, war-driven price increases, fertilizer-driven supply reductions, labor shortages, and summer heat stress will produce conditions in low-income American communities that have not been seen since the early months of the pandemic, when shelves were empty and food bank lines wrapped around buildings. The summer heat will stress crops and livestock in cold storage and transportation and the grid simultaneously. Summer heat is not just a weather event for agriculture. It is a compound stressor that affects every node in the food supply chain simultaneously. Crops that are already receiving less fertilizer and less water due to drought conditions will be hit by July and August heat that pushes temperatures above the threshold where corn, wheat, and soybean growth stalls or reverses. The USDA has documented that heat stress during the pollination window for corn, typically in July, can reduce yields by 30% or more in a single week of extreme temperatures. Livestock suffer in heat. Cattle, hogs, and poultry all reduce their feed intake during heat waves, which slows growth, reduces milk production, reduces egg production, and increases mortality. The U.S. beef cattle herd is already at its lowest level since 1962. Any additional stress on that herd, whether from heat, drought, or feed, cost increases driven by the fertilizer disruption, pushes the recovery timeline further into the future. The poultry industry, which is still recovering from the culling of 185 million birds due to avian influenza, is particularly vulnerable because poultry are among the most heat-sensitive livestock species. Cold storage and refrigerated transport, which are essential for preventing food spoilage in summer, consume enormous quantities of electricity. and electricity prices have already risen faster than wages according to the Urban Institute, with residential customers paying approximately $40 more per month in December 2025 than in December 2017. Data centers are competing for grid capacity. The Iran war is pushing natural gas prices higher, and the combination of heat-driven demand spikes and war-driven supply constraints on the electrical grid creates the conditions for rolling brownouts and blackouts in regions where peak summer demand exceeds generation capacity. When a cold storage facility loses power for 12 hours, the food inside it spoils. When a refrigerated truck breaks down in 105-degree heat, the load is condemned. When a grocery store's refrigeration system cycles off during a brownout, the meat and dairy in the case begin the clock toward unsafe temperatures. The summer heat is not separate from the food crisis. It is the accelerant that compounds every other vulnerability I have described. The fertilizer shortage reduces yields. The labor shortage reduces harvest. The energy cost increase raises prices. The snap cuts reduce purchasing power, and the heat stress attacks the storage and transportation infrastructure that connects the food that was grown to the household that needs to eat it. Every layer of the system is under simultaneous stress. And the American grocery store, with its 72-hour inventory and its just-in-time supply chain and its assumption that the trucks will keep coming and the power will stay on and the workers will show up, is the endpoint of a chain that is fraying at every link. What hits grocery stores this summer is not a single crisis. It is the convergence of 7 crises in a system that was designed for 0. Share this video with every American you know who buys food, because the difference between a household that stocked its pantry in April and a household that discovers the price increases in August is the difference between preparation and panic. And panic in a food system with 72 hours of inventory is what turns a price increase into a shortage. Subscribe and turn on notifications. I will be tracking every food price, every crop report, every fertilizer shipment, every snap change, and every harvest projection through the entire summer. No spin, no party line, just the truth about what is coming for your grocery store and what you can still do before it arrives. Take care of yourselves out there. Stock your pantry, fill your freezer, and I will see you in the next one. Because this is not the last time I will talk about your grocery store this year. This is the beginning. The planning decisions being made right now in April 2026 are locking in the harvest that arrives in August and September. And those decisions are being made with 75% of normal fertilizer, with 40% higher input costs, with a depleted labor force, with record high farm debt, and with a cattle herd at its lowest level in 64 years. The food that was not planted will not be harvested. The fertilizer that was not applied will not produce the yield. The workers who were deported will not pick the crop, and the cost of all of that will arrive at your grocery receipt this summer. Be ready.